You're listening to a download from the BBC. In this edition of File on 4, Allan Urry investigates claims of dirty tricks in one of Britain's biggest police forces.
I'm Paul Bailey. I'm a serving detective constable of Greater Manchester Police, and I investigate murders, serious and organised crime, money laundering, the most serious criminality that occurs.
A serving detective accuses his own police force of criminal behaviour.
I've come to speak to you today because no investigation has taken place, and I've literally been stonewalled. The public needs to know what's going on.
He says he's gathered evidence alleging corruption and victimisation by a unit within the force against other police officers. He's not alone. Other officers say they've been unfairly targeted, ending up sacked or in jail.
You rock the boat, you annoy sufficient people in positions of power. This is the consequence. I've ended up out of a job. This is where it's landed me.
Police have a duty to root out corruption within their ranks, but have Greater Manchester gone too far? In an interview with File on 4, the Chief Constable says he's trying to find out, but standards must be upheld.
Would your listeners want an officer who has influence in this organisation, who is deliberately dishonest, to be serving as a police officer? I don't think they would. So this is the carpet coming up.
Yeah, that's the carpet coming up.
Pretty standard floorboards here.
Yeah, standard floorboards.
Oh, there's the piping, yes.
That's the piping that was repaired. And if you see now...
And I can see the repaired joint there.
Well, there's a,
Mohammed Razak had a burst pipe in his house. It caused quite a bit of damage.
So the water had leaked from here and gone into the dining room, come out of the dining room chandelier, and then gone into the kitchen. The kitchen is below here, and it had gone through the spotlights. Every single spotlight.
That leak at his home in Bolton started a process that would land him in jail. Mr. Razak was a serving police inspector of more than 30 years standing.
My time in service has been a really positive time. I had a totally unblemished record within the police service. I've got a number of citations of merit, so I had no problems whatsoever.
As an Asian officer and neighbourhood inspector, Mr. Razak's role was community engagement, sometimes helping to ease tensions in diverse areas of Bolton. He was also fronting recruitment campaigns for Greater Manchester Police. But as he neared the end of his time in service, he got into a row with his employer. At the time, his division had one inspector too many, so he was asked to perform a different role and join a response unit. He regarded this as a demotion and argued there were less experienced, younger candidates who would be more suitable for the move. But that was rejected. This rumbled on. Eventually, Mr. Razak believed he was being singled out because of his race and said so. After that, things got difficult.
The point that I thought that things were getting really serious was when I was accused of taking 2 days annual leave 18 months previously without having submitted an annual leave form. They were accusing me of theft of 2 days' pay.
A criminal offence?
Yes, alleging a criminal offence, that was dishonesty and that was theft. And that was where I knew that they were obviously after me for something. I had taken the annual leave, but I had submitted a rest days in lieu form, which are days that are owed to you when you have worked on your rest days to help the organisation out, and they've accumulated on your rest days in lieu database. They had not checked the rest days in lieu database, had only checked the annual leave database.
Mohammed Razak made a formal complaint about the way the matter was handled. It was resolved, but he'd been shaken by the accusations, and because he was eligible for retirement, decided he would leave. On the day he made that announcement, he got a surprise visit.
The doors burst open and 4 officers came in, and one of them told me to stand up and stand against the wall, quite disrespectfully arrested me on suspicion of perverting the course of justice and misconduct in a public office.
In relation to what, though?
At that time, they'd only mentioned that they'd arrested me for misconduct in a public office and perverting the course of justice, and gave no reason.
Later it emerged it was about a suspect accused of tax crimes by HMRC, but on bail to the Bolton Division. Mr Razak says the man had been asking police officers for advice about bail conditions because he believed his were being abused by tax investigators. Those he approached included Inspector Razak, a custody officer and a chief inspector. Mr Razak's account is that he told the man to get legal advice if he felt his rights were being affected and argue it in court. The suspect apparently did so, and his conditions were lifted by the court. But Inspector Razak found himself on bail, accused of corruption offences. Greater Manchester said he was being investigated in a wider inquiry. Detectives from the internal counter-corruption unit were leading it. They're part of the Force's Professional Standards branch. The branch deals with, amongst other matters, internal discipline, and the CCU carries out covert operations investigating criminal allegations as part of its work. During this investigation, his home in Bolton was raided.
Well, it was really early in the morning, 6:30 in fact. My wife was in the lounge, and as you can see, we have a big bay window onto the main road, and she could see that a number of people were outside of the house. She thought they were police officers. She was panicking, she was out of breath, very, very worried.
So what you're doing, you're coming down the stairs?
Yeah, I then run down the stairs with my pyjamas on. When I open the door, it's police officers that I recognise. Now, all the neighbours can see what's going on, so they then show me a warrant and say that they've come to search the house again. They come in, they enter, they stood in this lobby. One of the officers then tells me that I am again being arrested.
Why so many police officers turning up?
Well, I couldn't understand myself. Documents, computers, everything had gone.
Mr Razak argues police were out to get him, and he wasn't the only one who thought so. In accordance with usual practice, he'd been assigned a police welfare officer, a chief inspector called John Buttress. Mr Buttress certainly had concerns about the way the inquiry into the inspector was being handled.
I didn't think the organisation was treating him fairly. He was a police officer with something like 34 years' service. As far as I'm aware, he'd been arrested for something which there had been no previous indication of behaviour like that in his previous 30-odd years in the force. It seemed he was being treated in a very strange way by the Professional Standards branch. Things like the heavy-handed nature of his arrest. There were other things had been seized from his house which didn't appear to be related to the investigation that was being conducted. And, those are strict rules that the police have to follow. You can't just go into someone's house and take things away. It's appeared to me, in his case, that they'd been on a fishing expedition trying to find evidence of other offences.
So is that what happened? The allegations of corruption against Mohammed Razak, for which he'd originally been arrested, were dropped. But he was then charged with crimes which were a world away from suspicions he'd been assisting suspects. Now it was mortgage and insurance fraud. Some related to claims he'd made because of the water damage at his properties. And for this, he stood trial. That took place here at Minchell Street Crown Court in Manchester. There were 5 counts of fraud, 3 of money laundering and 1 of failing to disclose information, all related to financial affairs around properties he owned. After 6 weeks of evidence and deliberation, he was found guilty on all of them. The prosecution successfully argued he'd attempted to secure more favourable terms on property insurance, fraudulently obtained a £12,000 loan against one of his houses, and took out a personal mortgage for a house he bought to let. He was sentenced to 18 months in jail by the judge, who described him as thoroughly dishonest, brazenly and repeatedly breaking the law. It was a devastating result for a career police officer.
I never expected that I would be in prison. My mind was blank, I was stunned, and the experience is not a very nice experience, it's not meant to be. But it was shocking for me more so, and torturous, because I knew I was innocent. And the thing on my mind at that time was that when I get out, I'll continue to fight this. And this is why I've continued to fight it to this day.
He lost an appeal, but now File on 4 has uncovered fresh information involving a witness at his trial. I've just pulled up outside a low-rise block of flats in Salford, and I've come here to meet a couple who claim that one of their relatives actually lied in court about Mr. Razak in order to protect himself. Now, if that is the case, it raises serious questions about the safety of the conviction.
The first I'd heard of it was when my uncle phoned me. I was in work to say that he'd had a visit of 2 police officers to ask him had he done an invoice on any work for Mohammed Razak.
Brian Lord is in the building trade. He often worked for his uncle, John Lever. Mr. Lever was the Razak family's go-to builder. Following a leak at one of his properties, Mr. Razak typed out an estimate for repairs. The issue in court was, had he made up those figures to commit insurance fraud, or was it, as he asserted, an accurate estimate based on figures supplied by the family builders and written up with their agreement to make a more professional-looking job of it?
Mo asked my uncle if me and my uncle would be able to draft up an estimate so that he could approach other builders to get prices so that he could then approach the insurers.
Why couldn't you and your uncle write the invoices?
Well, it was just better for it to be printed and we had no access to computer or anything, you know.
So was it Mohammed Razak's estimate or was it yours that he typed?
Yeah, it was ours that he typed up, yeah. My uncle had already wrote it down. I got his book, yeah, I'd managed to find his book. And he wrote an estimate down, but like I say, it looks better if it's printed out for him to approach other builders and obviously for the insurance company.
But that's not the account Mr. Lever gave to the court. In fact, he appeared as a prosecution witness, washing his hands of any involvement. His nephew, Brian Lord, says that's because he felt pressurised by the police investigation and was worried he'd be reported about his tax affairs. By the time he got to court, what did he say?
He never supplied an estimate and that he never asked Mo to type up any invoice or estimate for him and that he hadn't done basically any work for him at all, which he had done.
And why did he say that?
Because he'd never paid taxes. He didn't want to get investigated by Inland Revenue and he'd rather die than spend a single day in jail.
He was an elderly man by this stage, wasn't he?
Oh, yes.
Quite poorly.
Yeah, he was in a wheelchair and everything, yeah. He had hearing aids, so he couldn't hear much at all. Emphysema.
How much was this on his mind then, the fact that he'd, by your account, lied in court?
Oh, a hell of a lot. It was really on his mind, to be honest with you. He was more like a father to me.
Brian Lord was too upset to continue because his uncle, John Lever, died 14 months ago. But it's not just his testimony that we wanted to hear. His wife says that she wrote down a confession that Mr. Lever made as he lay dying. He was bedridden, too poorly to do it himself. And I've got that letter here. He says, "I am John Joseph Lever." And the reason that he's writing it, he says, is that I wish to right a terrible wrong. And then it goes on over the page. The reason I'm writing this letter is because my actions and lies sent an innocent, decent, upstanding member of the community to prison for something he never done. I felt ashamed and embarrassed by my actions, but at the time I was too scared to come forward. And then at the bottom here it's printed his name and below it something that looks like a signature. We have no way of knowing if this is what was said or if the written confession is genuine. And even if it is, perhaps it's not a credible story from a man who'd spent his life dodging taxes. But his family have stuck to their account and have made a formal complaint to police about what they allege is the undue pressure he was put under. If there are legitimate questions about the evidence given by this witness, Mohammed Razak argues that's part of what casts his case in a new light. He's been trying to clear his name since leaving prison, and now he's made an application to the Criminal Cases Review Commission. He's also met with his MP, the Labour member for Lee and Shadow Home Secretary Andy Burnham. Mr Burnham's told File on 4 he supports the application for review.
The feeling I've had is that it doesn't add up, that something doesn't make sense. This is somebody that had served Greater Manchester Police for a long period of time without, it seemed to me, any blemish on his record. Things then seemed to change dramatically at the end of his career. Mo feels that he was unfairly victimised, and it's my job as his MP to support him and get to the bottom of this, and I don't think we're yet at the bottom of it. The suggestion is that some of the evidence in his case was not safe, so that is why I will support Mo Razak in taking his case to the Criminal Cases Review Commission, because I have concerns about his case. The Greater Manchester Police will, I'm sure, say, well, look, there's been a trial here. But the question is whether or not the evidence that was presented to that court is reliable. And that's the issue that I think needs to be looked at independently.
Greater Manchester Police Chief Constable Ian Hopkins agrees that if new evidence has come to light, it should be examined. But he points to the strength of the conviction in the first place.
If there is new evidence, then the appropriate authority to see that is the Criminal Cases Review Commission.
I mean, the family have complained to the police, the family who say their family member changed his story because they felt under pressure from the investigation.
Well, if that's what they're saying, then the Criminal Case Review Commission can look at it. As I said, he was convicted in the Crown Court, and as far as I'm concerned, that's the end of the matter for me at this stage.
When you look at his case in the round, though, one of the accusations against him was that he'd stolen 2 days' leave from his employer, and that was said to be criminal. It feels as though you were out to get him.
I think that whenever you have an investigation into an officer, there is a number of elements of information, intelligence that might come forward that are seen as potentially relevant by the investigating officer. Clearly, as you go through an investigation, the relevant evidence is what is put forward to the Crown Prosecution Service. That did not form part of that relevant evidence.
His MP, Andy Burnham, has concerns about the case. Does that trouble you?
Well, I've met with Andy Burnham. We had a very good conversation. I've explained to Andy Burnham everything that I'm doing. And I've said to Andy that, you know, if Mo Razak has those issues, he should go to the Criminal Case Review Commission, which you tell me he is now doing.
There's an interesting and, you might think, significant twist to the case of Mohammed Razak. All along, he had the support of a significant figure within Greater Manchester Police.
This is where the chicken food lives, and they know it.
A man so highly thought of that his face appeared on police recruitment posters across the country. A man being trained up to achieve chief officer grade. In short, a rising star in the ranks. And he lives at a farmhouse in a remote part of Wales.
I was promoted as a result of being on the fast track system. The sky's the limit on that scheme. It's designed to catapult people through to the very senior ranks of the police service, and it has done very successfully. I'd then been seconded to the Office of Security and Counter-Terrorism down at the Home Office. So there I'd worked with a lot of specialists in counter-terrorism. Then I came back to GMP.
This is John Buttress. You may remember him as the Chief Inspector who was Mr Razak's welfare officer. Mr Buttress had made separate complaints about bullying by a senior officer, which was another matter entirely, but he'd also lodged a formal protest about the way the Razak case was handled. He was actually prepared to appear in court as a defence witness, effectively going up against his own police force. But that didn't happen. A month before the trial, Chief Inspector Buttress was confronted by officers from the Counter-Corruption Unit.
At headquarters, I was summoned into a room with my then line manager. Then 4 or 5 officers walked into the room and read out a prepared statement saying I was under arrest. I couldn't believe it.
On that day, other officers took part in coordinated action, centred on his farmhouse property. The force helicopter flew overhead. It's the sort of resourcing usually reserved for a serious organised crime figure. So what did Greater Manchester Police say their talented Chief Inspector had done wrong?
I was accused of diddling my mileage. So they investigated the previous 6 months or so of my mileage claims. It turned out I'd underclaimed. So I forced through the payment of that underclaim, just as a matter of principle. They got a warrant from a Crown Court judge alleging I was money laundering. It said that on the warrant. I read it. The allegation was false, utterly false. I was accused of council tax evasion. I mean, that was ludicrous. It turned out I'd overpaid £1,779.41p, which the council refunded to me. I was accused of involvement in the construction industry without registering a business interest. As a police officer, you have to declare any business interest. Again, the allegation was groundless. They even looked at me for the possible failure to register a business interest because I was a church organist in the village. Eventually that wasn't pursued because I pointed out repeatedly that I wasn't getting paid. It was a voluntary thing. I mean, it's just utterly ridiculous, but it illustrates the lengths they went to.
None of this came to anything, and no charges were brought. Greater Manchester Police deny any connection between the arrest of John Buttress and his willingness to give evidence in defence of Mohammed Razak. Chief Constable Ian Hopkins says he first came under suspicion over an allegation of insider share dealing relating to a contract for police radios.
Mr. Buttress had an individual raise concerns about some of the potential relationship with an external provider. This is something that was taken very seriously, and professional standards started to look at that. Now, as it was, those concerns weren't justified.
He was accused of all sorts of petty crimes, though, in the middle of all this, wasn't he? Fiddling his expenses, turned out not to be true. Not paying his council tax, not true. Not declaring he's a church organist.
I mean, I think, there were a number of trivial things in there that really were of no interest. The mileage was clearly of an interest because one of the key issues was where Mr. Buttress was actually residing. Nothing came of it because there was nothing of any issue.
However, just like Mr. Razak, counter-corruption officers did find something they thought worthy of pursuing further. John Buttress was charged with fraud, centring on the financial arrangements for his property.
Lovely views out.
Yes, over the rolling hillside. It's beautiful.
Yes, and it's great because you can sit there with a glass of wine in the sun.
Although he says this was his home, Mr. Buttress sometimes stayed at a flat in Manchester. He was accused of failing to disclose to his mortgage company that this farmhouse in Wales was not his main residence. To clarify the matter, detectives interviewed staff at his bank on the 25th of March 2014. It was recorded. A transcript was made. A court statement obtained by File on 4 says the transcript was 5 pages long. A statement written up from it by investigating officers and served to the court was 4 pages long. A page was missing. Funnily enough, it was a very important page.
That page said, if Mr. Buttress lives in his house only at weekends, we don't care. That's still his main residence. And that was what that charge was, the main residence. I only clocked it because I listened to a tape recording of 2 police officers taking that statement, and I heard the lady saying things that I didn't remember reading. So I went back to the statement, and I listened to the tape again. When you start looking at the detail, the sentences at the bottom and top of the pages conveniently stop just before that page. The page numbering had been gone over with a great big felt tip so you couldn't see the numbers clearly. If I hadn't listened to that transcript, I could have been convicted in a Crown Court of something I hadn't done and been sent to prison.
Could it have been a mistake? Somebody just lost the page?
Absolutely not. The charge against me was utterly false, and they did nothing. They didn't speak up, they didn't tell the judge, they didn't tell the prosecution barristers.
The charge was dropped, but how come the page was missing? That's something which Kent police are investigating, having been called in by Greater Manchester following complaints by John Buttress. But it's a question I took up with Chief Constable Ian Hopkins.
The page was missing in a bundle that the CPS passed to the court. Nobody is suggesting that anybody was trying to hide that or the evidence wasn't there, because the evidence was there. It's just how that page came to be missing within the photocopying and the provision of the file to the court. And of course, Kent are looking at that.
It's just a key page that proved his innocence, wasn't it? That's what makes it suspicious.
I don't know whether it proved his innocence or not.
Well, on that particular charge, because the charge was dropped.
The charge was dropped on that particular one. But it's one page out of many, many, which is part of the reason why I've asked Kent to look at it.
The other pages in that bundle, which the court was asked to consider, related to another allegation against John Buttress about mortgage arrangements, this time concerning outbuildings on his property, which he lets out.
This is the barn, which sleeps 4 quite cosily. They put another charge to me that I was in breach of a mortgage subcondition because parts of my farm were let out to holidaymakers, as they had been for many, many years. Their argument was that because bits of the property were let out, I should have a buy-to-let mortgage.
Isn't the police's position, though, that they, particularly from senior officers, as you were still at that stage, they expect the highest standards of integrity?
Absolutely.
And they'll accept nothing less?
Absolutely, and that is entirely right. But you have to look at the facts of this case. What have I actually done wrong? Yes, technically I'm in breach of a sort of mortgage subclause A3.12 or whatever it is that says if you want to sublet parts of your property, you have to ask first. Well, hands up to that. No, I was in breach of a mortgage subclause on a page that I'd never read.
That oversight landed him in court. Out of all the accusations he'd faced, this was the only one a jury was asked to decide upon. This time last year, John Buttress was on trial at Liverpool Crown Court. The jury was told he'd applied for a remortgage after he and his wife had divorced. The prosecution asserted that at no point did he mention his plan to use the property as a holiday let, as required by the lender. In doing so, he was avoiding any interest or other payments due because he was letting it out. And this was said to be the fraud. Except it wasn't. After hearing 2 weeks of evidence, the jury was sent out to consider their verdict. It took them just 20 minutes to find the Chief Inspector not guilty.
When you stand outside a courtroom for those few minutes waiting for that verdict and then you walk back in, it was an experience that I don't think anybody should have to go through, let alone a serving police officer.
It must have been pretty stressful for you.
Of course it was, and not just for me, but my parents, my whole family, friends, and very many supportive people at the police. When I went back to Greater Manchester Police and I sat in the foyer, I can remember going back, a number of people came up to me and shook me warmly by the hand and said, we're really pleased to see you back. And it was very, very moving.
His employers weren't so pleased to see him. 4 months ago, he was sacked following a disciplinary hearing. Police said he'd fallen below their accepted standards in relation to honesty and integrity in his financial affairs. Now Mr Buttress is launching an employment tribunal, claiming unfair dismissal. He says he wants his job back, and he's already lodged with his former employer allegations of corruption and criminal wrongdoing by some of those involved in the investigations into him.
I put in 11 formal criminal complaint statements. They range from misconduct in public office through to hiding evidence, perjury in one case, submitting a false statement in another case. They're wide-ranging. Effectively, a number of officers have behaved in a corrupt and criminal manner in order to get me put in front of a Crown Court.
How many officers?
There's a total of 6 that I've reported.
And are all the complaints about the counter-corruption unit?
No, they're not. They're about the hierarchy as well. One of the criminal complaint statements is about a very, very senior officer.
How senior?
At Assistant Chief Constable level. Another is against the Chief Superintendent.
These allegations are also being looked into independently by Kent Police. But given their seriousness, John Buttress argues there should be a full criminal investigation. According to Chief Constable Ian Hopkins, the inquiry needs to run its course.
Mr Buttress has been written to several times by Kent, and he has been told in writing by the Deputy Chief Constable of Kent that nobody is under criminal investigation.
I think that's his complaint, isn't it? I'm making criminal allegations. They should be investigated in a criminal way.
They are being investigated thoroughly. What Kent are saying from their assessment of that at this stage is they do not believe that they meet the threshold for criminal conduct. So a number of officers have been served notice of investigation either for gross misconduct or misconduct. Nobody has been served a notice saying that the allegations reach the criminal threshold. Now, that's not to say that as they follow the evidence, there may be criminal allegations put to officers.
You can't rule that out.
I cannot rule that out, nor should we.
Both John Buttress and Mohammed Razak argue they were targeted because they'd made formal complaints and that because of that they were turned upon. But maybe they're nothing more than disgruntled former employees out to get their own back. Why on earth would the Professional Standards Branch go to such lengths if these men had done nothing wrong? Up to now, the programme has been airing concerns from those who are no longer in police service. But File on 4 has also interviewed a serving detective who's prepared to go on the record because he believes that allegations he's brought are not being properly investigated. And they're the same kinds of allegations we've already been hearing. Corrupt practices by some within the Professional Standards Branch of Greater Manchester Police.
I'm probably the most investigated officer still in service in GMP.
Detective Constable Paul Bailey works for the Force's Major Incident Team, which investigates the most serious of crimes, such as murder. He's locked horns with his employers on many occasions during his 26 years service. He's currently chair of the Black and Asian Police Association. Last year, Paul Bailey won a tribunal case against Greater Manchester Police. He'd been one of a number of officers on secondment to a regional police unit investigating serious and organised crime. His role was redesignated. He lost his expenses and his car.
It was nothing more than another act of victimisation, another act of discrimination. It actually meant that I found myself in a less favourable situation or position than my colleagues that I was working with day to day.
Mr. Bailey made a formal complaint about the way he'd been treated and decided to take his case to tribunal, alleging racial discrimination. After the evidence had been heard, but before the verdict, he was told to report to his office.
We were waiting for the judgment, and I was called in to work, and I was served with gross misconduct papers for allegations of leaking information to the press. So gross misconduct as opposed to misconduct means that the force has the ability to sack me.
Had you been leaking things to the press?
No, I hadn't.
And what was the result of that investigation?
I was never interviewed, and it was dropped because there was no evidence that I'd done anything wrong.
Greater Manchester say the timing of that was out of their control because, following complaints from two members of the public, they'd called in an outside force to investigate. Paul Bailey won that tribunal case, and Greater Manchester lost an appeal. They've appealed again. Meanwhile, he remains in service, working with the major incident team. But he says he's still concerned about the way his police force investigates its own officers. He's pulled together evidence of cases that allege wrongdoing.
I'd seen a number of practices in GMP, and particularly the professional standards branch, that I believed that were corrupt. So what I had done is I'd compiled a dossier. This dossier included reports written by a number of people, members of the Police Federation who worked as representatives for people under misconduct investigation, reports written by legal professionals, barristers and solicitors that all raised concerns about investigations conducted by the Professional Standards Branch. Evidence of wrongdoing and criminal offences. Now, I'm not going to say that all of the Professional Standards Branches are corrupt, because I'm sure that's just not the case, but I have seen a number of allegations made about a number of different officers, which is concerning, and I think that the conduct of the department as a whole is concerning and needs to be addressed.
DC Bailey won't share the details of his dossier with us because he says it contains confidential information that would be in breach of police standards. Separately, however, we've established that one of the cases is that of Scott Winters, an inspector based at Stockport who took GMP to tribunal alleging racial discrimination. He settled the case last year. Mr. Winters is a decorated officer with 29 years' service. He claims he was targeted after reprimanding a junior officer. He was then accused of assault and says he became the victim of a disproportionate and discriminatory investigation. We've seen legal documents about that case, and they raise further troubling questions for professional standards. I've got a copy of a letter from Inspector Winters' solicitor to an Assistant Chief Constable at Greater Manchester, and this follows the eventual release of unused material the police were holding on to. The solicitor says that material shows differences between earlier versions of statements and those which were finally submitted as part of a bundle of evidence. He complains there are handwritten notes on the originals suggesting some parts needed removing, amending or adding to. This, he argues, is prejudicial to Inspector Winters' case. There's a reference to a missing page within a statement, a page containing key information, and that's something we've heard about in other cases. And a reference to prejudicial and inadmissible evidence submitted by GMP. The letter concludes that, among other matters, there should be a full investigation into the methods used by the PSB to obtain statements. Inspector Scott Winters is still in post. He was cleared of any misconduct. Later, the Chief Constable wrote a personal letter of apology to him. We've got a copy of that too. And this is what he said.
I accept that the standard of investigation was not acceptable. Mistakes were made and inappropriate decisions were taken, some of which appear not to have been proportionate in relation to the matters being investigated.
The Chief Constable would be interviewed about this, saying they'd had no confirmation from Inspector Winters that he'd given consent for his details to appear in the programme. But the Winters case will strike a chord with Shadow Home Secretary and MP for Lee, Andy Burnham.
Other people have come to me, including constituents, who've said there's a similar pattern of events here. Now, that's one side of the story, so I can't say that that proves something against Greater Manchester Police. What is being said to me is that charges are brought very zealously against individuals for reasons that I'm not certain about. And then there's, of course, the legal costs that accrue to those kind of investigations. So The question I've got to ask is it in the public interest that those cases have been brought? And I'm aware there are cases where those charges ultimately have been dropped. So it is my job then to ask some questions about whether or not the Greater Manchester Police is going about these concerns in the right way. Of course, there is the need for a professional standards department, because of course there is a need to hold police officers to account, to make sure that they are fulfilling their public duties. So we do need to have an open, transparent, accountable police force. But the question is, has that gone too far in certain ways with regards to the way professional standards are operating?
And that's the question which needs answering now. Because at the heart of this is the integrity of the police. If officers don't trust some of their own colleagues, why should we? Chief Constable Ian Hopkins hopes the independent reviews and investigations which are currently underway will get to the bottom of whatever needs to be found out. Central to that is a review he's commissioned from the Metropolitan Police into his Professional Standards branch.
What I would say is that the Professional Standards Department deal with around about 350 to 400 investigations a year. You know, we have around about half a dozen cases, maybe as many as 9 or 10, where over a period of 3-4 years concerns have been raised. That is a very, very small number. They've also been inspected by Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary on at least 3 occasions, and HMIC have said that the Professional Standards Department's well managed, has effective processes and governance, and effective investigation of complaints and allegations.
In overall terms then, what is your view now of your Professional Standards Department? Are they treading the right line?
I think, there's a number of issues in there. I am taking very seriously the concerns that have been raised, which is why I've articulated what I've asked to be done. I will wait to see what that brings forward, whether it's the Kent investigation or whether it's the Metropolitan Police peer review, and then I will make an assessment as to the health of professional standards.